Hi everyone, welcome to freepilotgroundschool.ca. This is your first lesson. We're going to start with air law licensing requirement, and this lesson will cover everything that you need to know for your private and your recreational pilot permit with respect to the requirements. Unfortunately, this is probably the most boring lesson of the entire ground school, so please bear with me. However, hopefully by the end of this lesson, I get into some more interesting things such as privileges and reimbursement of costs, which are unfortunately not on the syllabus, even though they should be, but they are left off, but they are somewhat more interesting. So let's get started. So here we are on our first lesson with every lawyer's favorite introductory topic, the interpretation of the regulations. And unfortunately, this lesson will lead off with our first boring stamp to let you know that now might be a time to zone out or maybe not. But we'll get started with some interpretation. So our first interpretation talks about an aeroplane. This word shows up throughout the regulations. It is a category of aircraft, similar to helicopters, another category. And in this case, it does not include an ultralight. That is a separate category. Our next definition, dual flight instruction. This talks about when you are training for a license, you may be receiving dual flight instruction from a flight instructor or another person who is qualified to provide instruction. We talk about a glider, which in this case includes a powered glider. And then the next definition is a high performance aeroplane. This will come up when you receive your license, and it says that you are allowed to fly all non-high performance aeroplanes. High performance aeroplane having a maximum speed of more than 250 knots or a stall speed of 80 knots or greater. Then there's also some wing loading requirements in an amateur built aeroplane, which you don't need to be aware of. Further to your flight training, when we talk about solo flight time, that is when you are flying the aircraft by yourself. When you just have a student pilot permit, your solo flight time, you can be the only flight crew member on board the aircraft. And when you're working on, let's say, a commercial pilot license, a solo flight time, you could bring a passenger along, but it could not be a flight instructor or someone else that's responsible for any flight crew responsibilities. So it obviously goes without saying that if you want to fly an aircraft, you must have the appropriate license, permit, or rating to fly the aircraft. And if you're flying an aircraft that's registered in another country, in the way the CARS puts it, in another contracting state other than Canada, let's say you fly an aircraft that has an N registration for the United States, you must have the appropriate license, permit, or rating in Canada, or you must have the appropriate license from the other country. So if you're flying an American aircraft in Canadian airspace, you either need to have a Canadian license or an American license. There are a number of recurrency and recency requirements in the CARS, and these are highlighted yellow in this ground school. So you can expect that you will see a question on one of your exams that deal with these recency requirements. The first one is that within the last 5 years, you have to have acted as a pilot in command. As well, every 2 years, you require recurrency training. So you have to do some sort of training, whether that's a flight review with a flight instructor, you can do an additional license, or the simplest thing that most people do is simply do a recurrency seminar with Transport Canada or a flight instructor, or in the aviation safety letter, they often publish a self-directed open book quiz that you can do, and you just keep a hold of that. That keeps you current for 2 years. You also need to do 5 takeoffs and landings in the last 6 months if you want to carry passengers. If you don't have the requirement, you just do those 5 takeoffs and landings solo or with an instructor. You do need to keep personal logbooks for your licenses. And just a brief talk about privileges. A private pilot license can act as a pilot in command or second in command of an aircraft that's endorsed. Along with your pilot's license, you are also required to have a valid medical certificate that validates your license. If you do not have a medical certificate, that's essentially the same as flying without a license, and you will likely be fined the same as anyone else would. There is a validity period to these medical certificates. If you're under 40 years of age, that's 60 months or 5 years, and 24 months if you're over 40. That's for what we call a Category 3 medical certificate. There is a requirement that if you have any medical issue that you advise the Minister of Transport, so Transport Canada in this case, as soon as possible if this medical issue may affect safety of flight. So let's say you have a prescription drug, let's just say a SSRI, a common antidepressant, your family physician put you on that drug, you are required to let the Minister of Transportation know. When you get your medical examination by your Canadian or your civil aviation medical examiner, they will mark you fit or unfit in your aviation document booklet. Let's talk about some of the privileges that you can have with a student pilot permit, a rec permit, or a private pilot license. And we went over this just briefly earlier in this ground school, but let's talk about it a bit more in depth. So for a student pilot permit, you're actually allowed flying an aircraft by yourself when supervised by a flight instructor. So it's kind of different than when you learn to drive your car, you have your mom or dad in the car and you get your learner's permit. Well, you are allowed flying an aircraft by yourself with a student pilot permit. But there are some restrictions. You're obviously not allowed any passengers. You can only do it for the purposes of flight training and day VFR. VFR stands for Visual Flight Rules. So only in good weather. And the key thing is that you can only do it, you can only fly solo when you are supervised by a flight instructor. And so what that means is the flight instructor on the ground will tell you where you're going to go and what you're going to do. They are most likely going to check the weather together with you to make sure the weather is suitable. And they may be at the airport while you're flying, but in no case would they ever just let you go wherever you want, whenever you want. They might talk to you on the phone first if you have been a student for quite a while. So it is a bit flexible, but what the student pilot permit does not allow you to do is, let's say, buy your own aircraft and just go flying your airplane whenever you feel like it. That is strictly prohibited. So let's talk about the recreational pilot permit. The recreational pilot permit is kind of a light mini version of the private pilot license. It allows some of the privileges. Generally, I tell students the way to think about it is it's like a student pilot permit. You're really learning, but you no longer need the supervision of an instructor to go flying. You can fly whenever you want, whenever you think it's safe. You're only allowed to fly an aircraft that is a maximum of 4 seats. So like the Cessna 172 that you perhaps learned to fly in. You're also allowed to fly in the ultralight. But the difference is you can only fly one passenger. You can't fill that 4-seat Cessna 172 up full of your friends. You can only fly during the day. Can't fly at night unless you get a private pilot license and then a night rating. And you can fly in Canada only. You cannot go in the States. What you can do still with a recreational pilot permit is you can fly a ski plane or a float plane as endorsed on your license. Then lastly, we can talk about the private pilot license. The private pilot license allows you to fly any aircraft that you're endorsed on. So for example, if you get a multi-engine rating after your private pilot license, you would be allowed to fly multi-engine aircraft. Same thing goes with a float plane. If you want to fly at night, you could get a night rating. You could get an instrument rating if you wanted to fly in instrument conditions, so you want to fly in cloud. And the other key thing of the private pilot license, you cannot accept any remuneration for your services. That requires a commercial pilot license. So you cannot have a private pilot license and then go take a job with a company that will pay you for your services as a pilot. Let's talk about the reimbursement of costs for an aircraft. This subject is not on the syllabus for the private pilot license, but it's a really important subject because a lot of private pilots are under some misinterpretation of the CARS, what they're allowed doing and what they are not allowed doing with respect to being reimbursed for an aircraft. So a lot of pilots think is, oh, well, I'm going to go to Owen Sound, let's just say, and my friend wants to go to Owen Sound, and they're going to pay me a few $100s to take them up there, and that is against the rules. So what the rules say is that you have to be the owner and operator of the aircraft. So you cannot accept a reimbursement of a cost when you've rented an aircraft from a flying school. The second criteria is that the purpose of the flight has to be other than hire or reward. And this kind of goes towards together with the next point, that passengers are incidental to the flight. So let's just say I'm going sightseeing. And the purpose of this flight is me going sightseeing. And then I have a friend who says, hey, can I come sightseeing with you? And you say, hey, sure, come along. And they say, okay, I'll give you half the gas money. So that is legal, that you are allowed doing. And that might make your flight more fun and more affordable. What is not allowed is when your friend calls you up and says, hey, I want to go sightseeing. Can we go sightseeing? I'll give you gas money. So that is now for hire or reward, and the passenger is not incidental to the flight. The reason you are going flying is because you want to go sightseeing, because your friend is paying you some money. So this comes up quite often with Transport Canada. In one case that I'm somewhat familiar with, a fella had a twin-engine aircraft, and somebody called them up and said, hey, can you fly me to St. Catharines? I need to go pick up another airplane that I just bought. And the person said, yeah, sure, that will be $650 or some sort of amount there. And then they flew that person there, and somehow the regulator got wind of this, and there was an investigation, and the gentleman that accepted the money ended up with a considerable fine. Now, there's also some exceptions too to this reimbursement of costs. For example, you are an employee of a company employed in a capacity other than as a pilot. Let's just say you're a salesman or a real estate agent or an engineer or something like that, and you happen to have a private pilot's license, and you need to go somewhere to do some work. And so your employer says, hey, I need you to get there really quick. Hey, you have an airplane. How about you go take the airplane up there and I'll reimburse you? So that is legal as long as you are not employed as a pilot with that company. The other exception is for charitable not-for-profit organizations. So for example, the CASERA, which is a search and rescue organization, or the Royal Canadian Air Cadets, they might want to take an airplane flying with some of their air cadets. So they approach private pilots with their own aircraft and say, hey, here's our going rate. It's, let's say, $150 an hour. Can you spend your Saturday flying our air cadets around? And so that is essentially for cost. It's not for a profit basis. The pilot is doing it, spending their time out of the goodness of their heart, and wants to give back. That is legal. The other exception is for crop dusting. And this is kind of a strange one because you can actually run a profitable crop dusting organization as a private pilot without any regulatory oversight. And there are a number of exceptions or a number of rules to this. You can only crop dust you have to be a farmer to start with, and you can only be within 25 miles of your farm. So if you want to go beyond that, you probably need an air operating certificate. So let's just finish off this lesson with a review of what we've learned, the important parts. Let's talk about recency requirement. You have to be a pilot in command within the last 5 years. You have to complete recurrent training every 2 years, and you must do 5 takeoffs and landings during day or night within the last 6 months if you want to carry passengers. A private pilot, you have the privileges of acting as a pilot in command or second in command of any aircraft if endorsed. Or if you're not endorsed, if you're trained and supervised by an instructor. Your medical certificate is what keeps your license valid. The medical certificate is valid for 60 months if you're under 40 years of age, or 24 months if over 40 years of age. Let's go through some sample questions that you might see on your private pilot license written examination, or perhaps your pre-solo test, also called your P-STAR test. So the first one, a pilot in command must complete blank takeoffs and landings every 6 months. So just take a look through these answers, see if you can come up with it. And Hopefully you remembered that it is 5 takeoffs and landings every 6 months. Our last question, a Category 3 pilot medical certificate is valid for blank months for pilots under the age of blank, and blank for pilots over the age of blank. So we know that the demarcation for age and medical is 40 years of age, so that should eliminate options C and D. And we know that somebody younger will have a longer medical validity period than somebody shorter. So by process of elimination, in case we don't have this memorized, we can conclude that the correct answer is B, that a Category 3 pilot medical certificate is valid for 60 months for pilots under the age of 40 and 24 months for pilots over the age of 40. This is our last sample question. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you on our second lesson of air law.